The night air is dry. The street is quiet. A lantern swings a little in the wind, making long shadows move like living things. Inside a small room above a saloon, a man sits alone at a table. He is not old, but he looks tired in a deep way. His face is sharp, his eyes are steady. On the table are two strange worlds placed side by side. On one side, there are clean tools. Metal instruments, small and exact, the kind a dentist uses. They shine softly in the lantern light. On the other side, there are gambling cards and a gun. The cards are worn at the edges. The gun is kept close, like a second hand. The man's name is John Henry Holliday. Most people do not call him that anymore. They call him Doc. They call him Doc Holliday. He is a dentist who does not live like a dentist. He is a sick man who keeps moving. He is a quiet man who somehow becomes part of loud history. Outside, the saloon below is full of voices. Men laugh, glasses clink. A piano plays a tune that sounds happy, but the notes are thin. In the West, music can hide fear. It can hide trouble. It can hide the truth. Doc listens for a moment. Then he coughs. It is not a small cough. It is not the kind that goes away with water. It shakes him. He leans forward slightly, pressing a hand to his mouth. When he pulls his hand away, he looks at it quickly. He does not show anyone. He does not need to. He already knows what it means. He has tuberculosis. People call it consumption. It is the illness that steals breath, weight, and time. In those days, it is almost a death sentence. It does not rush. It waits. It drains. Doc understands that better than anyone. That is why he does not live like he has a long future. He lives like a man who has borrowed time and refuses to waste it. But there was a time when John Henry Hallett looked like he would have a normal life. He was born in the American South, in Georgia. Came from a family that cared about reputation. People expected him to be polite, educated, successful, a man who wears clean clothes and works in a clean place, a man who builds a life that makes others proud. He was smart, he studied, he trained to be a dentist. That is not a small thing. It takes work, it takes patience, it takes steady hands. He learned how to fix pain with skill, not with force. He learned to sit close to someone's fear and make it smaller. For a while, it seemed that would be his story. A young doctor, a stable job, a home, a future. And then the future changed. The illness came and took away the normal path. Tuberculosis did not only attack his lungs, it attacked his choices. It made him weak at times. It made him cough until his ribs hurt. It made him feel the cold truth in the back of his mind. He might not reach old age. Many people, when they hear that kind of news, become careful. They slow down. They stay close to home. They try to live quietly. Doc did not. He did the opposite. He went west. People said the dry air might help. People said a different climate could give him more time. But it was not only about health. The West was also a place where a man could become someone else. It was a place where names could change, where past mistakes could be left behind, where a person could start over, even if they were running from something inside their own body. In the West, Doc tried to keep being a dentist. But the work was hard to hold on to. The coughing came at bad times. His energy faded. Patients did not always trust a man who looked like he was fighting his own breath. So he found another way to live. He gambled. Gambling was not just entertainment for Doc. It was survival. It was money without roots. It was a job that could move from town to town. A dentist needs a stable place. A gambler only needs a table, a deck of cards, and the nerve to sit down. And Doc had nerve. He had something even stronger than confidence. He had nothing to lose. That is a dangerous kind of strength. It makes a man calm in moments when others shake. It makes him stare at trouble without blinking. It makes him speak soft words to loud men. Soon, people begin to notice him. Not only because he is smart, or because he wins, but because he is different. He is polite, but not weak. He is thin, but not fragile. He looks like he belongs in a clean office with bright windows. Yet he sits in smoky rooms with men who carry knives. Some men think he is fake. Some men think he is arrogant. Some men think he is easy to scare. They learn quickly that he is not. Doc Holliday is not the biggest man in the room. He is not the loudest. He is not the strongest. But he is often the coldest Doc. He watches people. He reads faces. He understands when a smile is real and when it is only a warning. He understands that the West has its own rules, and he learns how to play by them. In town after town, stories grow around him. Some are true, some are not. That is how legends start. A small fact becomes a bigger tale. A tense moment becomes a shootout in the telling. A rumor becomes a known truth. But even before the legend becomes large, one thing is clear. Trouble follows Doc. Or maybe Doc follows trouble. Downstairs, the saloon door opens. Cold air slides in. Boots step on the wood floor. A voice carries up the stairs. It is sharp, like a knife edge. There is laughter, but it is not friendly laughter. Doc stands slowly. He does not rush. He picks up his coat. He checks his gun without looking at it. Like a man checking a pocket watch. He takes one last glance at the dentist tools on the table. For a second, it seems like he is looking at another life. A life that could have been. A life with white walls and clean hands. A life without danger. Then, he turns away. He walks toward the stairs. He is about to step into the noise. He is about to step into another test. And somewhere out there, in another part of the West, a lawman named Wyatt Earp is walking his own hard road. He does not know it yet, but his fate is moving toward Doc Holliday's fate. Two men, two different reasons, one coming storm. Doc reaches the top step. He pauses. He listens. The room below goes quiet for a breath, like the world is holding still. Then, Doc begins to descend, because the West does not care if a man is sick, and Doc Holliday does not care if the West is dangerous. He is coming down anyway. When John Henry Holliday was young, people could easily imagine his future. He had the kind of face that looked calm in a family photo. He spoke with education. He carried himself like someone who had been taught manners since childhood. In the South, that mattered. A person's name, family, and reputation could open doors. And John had all three. He was not born into the Wild West. He was born into a world of rules. In school, he worked hard. He learned fast. He chose dentistry because it was respectable, skilled, and clean. Dentistry was not an easy path, but it was a clear one. If he stayed on that road, he could become a successful professional. He could build a quiet life, and for a moment, it looked like he would. He earned his dental training far from the dusty frontier. He studied, tested, practiced, and became Dr. Holliday with real credentials. When he held those dental tools, they were not props. They were proof that he belonged in a different kind of world. But the body does not always respect plans. In his early 20s, the cough began. At first, it may have sounded like a cold that would pass, the kind of cough that people ignore until it becomes too loud to ignore. But this one stayed. It grew deeper. It brought fever and weakness. It came back again and again, like a dark visitor who refused to leave. Then came the truth. Tuberculosis. In those days, tuberculosis was feared like a shadow that followed a person into every room. It took away strength and breath. It made the skin look pale and thin. It could turn a bright young man into someone who looked older than he was. And worse than that, it took away certainty. John Holliday understood what he was facing. He also understood something else. He could not fight tuberculosis with pride. He could not shame it away. He could not outwork it. People told him the air in the West might help. Dry climates were believed to be better for weak lungs. So John did what many young men did not have the courage to do. He left. He stepped away from the life that made sense on paper. He stepped away from the normal future, and he headed toward places where the sun was harsh, the wind was rough, and men carried weapons like they carried wallets. He moved to Texas, where towns were growing fast and trouble grew faster. He tried to keep doing dentistry. He set up practice. He worked with patients. He did the job he was trained to do, but the illness did not care that he was a doctor. Some days he could work. Some days the coughing ruined everything. Patients did not want to sit in a chair while their dentist struggled to breathe. People feared sickness. They feared weakness. They feared anything they could not control. And so the world around him began to push him into a corner. He could keep trying to be the man he used to be, or he could become the man he needed to be to survive. That is how the gambling tables entered his life. At first, gambling may have been a way to earn extra money, a way to stay afloat when work was uneven. But gambling has a way of grabbing people, not because of the cards, but because of the feeling. At a card table, a man does not have to pretend he is healthy. He only has to pretend he is confident. At a card table, no one asks about his cough. They ask about his bets. And Doc learned how to sit perfectly still while the world tried to read him. He became good at it. Not only at the game, but at the moment around the game. The small movements, the faces, the lies, the quiet threats behind polite words. The more time he spent around gamblers, the more he understood something simple and brutal. In the West, respect was not given for education. Respect was given for nerves. Soon, the stories began. A thin dentist with sharp eyes. A polite man who could insult someone without raising his voice. A sick man who did not act scared. A gambler who would not back down when the room got tense. Sometimes. It started small. A man would accuse Doc of cheating. Another man would call him weak. Another man would laugh at his coughing, and Doc would look at them as if they were children playing with fire. Because Doc's fear was not like their fear. Most men feared death because it felt far away and unknown. Doc did not have that luxury. Death had been introduced to him early. Death had sat beside him for years. Death was not a surprise anymore. It was a fact, and when a person stops being surprised by death, he becomes difficult to control. That is when trouble began to circle him more closely. A gambler's life is not calm. Money changes hands fast. Anger rises fast. Drinks turn words into fights, and fights turn into shots. A small insult can start a chain that ends with blood on the floor. Doc found himself in that world again and again. Sometimes he was the target. Sometimes he was the spark. Many stories about him became larger than life, and not all of them can be trusted. But what can be trusted is the shape of his life. He moved from town to town, and he lived close to danger. There was another thing that mattered to Doc. In those rough places, Doc met people who understood the hard side of survival. Some were friends for a season, some were enemies, some were both. And one woman became part of his story in a way that lasted. A tough, complicated woman, often known by the nickname Big Nose Kate. She did not fit the quiet life either. She was not delicate. She was not easily controlled. She lived in the same dangerous spaces as Doc, and she knew how quickly a person could fall. Their relationship was not a smooth love story. It was a stormy one full of leaving, returning, forgiving, and fighting. But in a world where most people feared Doc or judged him, Kate stayed close enough to see the man behind the legend. And she saw what others did not always see Doc. Doc was not only sharp and dangerous, Doc was also tired. Doc tired of coughing. Doc tired of moving. Tired of watching people treat him like he was already dead, so he leaned into the identity the West gave him. Doc became a name that meant more than dentistry. It became a warning as time passed. He drifted toward the frontier towns where law and crime lived side by side. Places where badges mattered, but guns mattered more. Places where a man's reputation could protect him or get him killed. And somewhere in that growing world of saloons and dust, Doc began to hear another name, a lawman's name, a name spoken with a mix of respect and irritation, depending on who was talking. Wyatt Earp. Doc had not met him yet. But the West has a way of pulling people together. It is like a river that carries different lives into the same narrow place. Doc kept moving. He kept coughing. He kept playing cards, like tomorrow was not promised, because for him, it wasn't. And as he walked deeper into the frontier, his story was about to collide with a man who believed in law, order, and family. A man who would change Doc's fate, a man who would become his closest friend. And when that friendship formed, it would not be gentle. It would be forged in heat, in danger, and in the kind of loyalty that could destroy them both. Doc Holliday did not become famous overnight. His name did not rise like a sudden shout. It spread the way smoke spreads slowly, quietly, and then everywhere. In the West, people watched him. They tried to figure him out. Some saw a thin man with a cough and assumed he was weak. Others saw his calm eyes and felt uneasy. He did not talk too much. He did not brag like many gamblers did. He did not smile often. But when he did, it looked sharp, like it carried a message. Doc moved from town to town, following the places where money flowed and where men took risks. Every town had a saloon. Every saloon had card tables, and every card table had a story waiting to turn dangerous. Doc learned early that the biggest danger at a gambling table was not losing money. It was hurting someone's pride. A man could lose his last dollar and still laugh. But if he felt embarrassed, if he felt fooled, if he felt small in front of others, he could become violent fast. The West was full of men who carried more anger than sense. Doc did not fear those men. That made him unusual. He had already stared at something worse than a gun. He had stared at the slow, steady truths of tuberculosis. He had felt his lungs burn. He had tasted blood in his mouth. He knew that death did not always come with noise. Sometimes it came quietly, in the middle of the night. So when a loud man threatened him with a knife or a pistol, Doc often looked bored, not careless, not foolish, just calm. That calmness became part of his reputation. But reputation in the West could help and harm at the same time. A man known for courage attracted respect, but he also attracted challenges. Some people wanted to test him. They wanted to see if he was real. Doc's life became full of those tests. One night, in a crowded saloon, a man accused Doc of cheating. The man's voice rose so everyone could hear. Heads turned, the music slowed. Even the bartender paused. Accusations like that could end a gambler's life. Doc did not jump up. He did not rush for his gun. He simply looked at the man as if he was studying him like a problem to solve. Then he spoke in a low voice. His words were polite, but they carried weight. He did not beg. He did not explain too much. He did not offer fear. That made the accuser angrier. Because angry men want reactions. They want panic. They want to feel powerful. Doc gave him none of that. The man reached for his weapon, and in one fast moment, the room changed. Chairs scraped. People stepped back. Someone whispered, "Don't." Doc did not move first. But when he moved with purpose. He stood up slowly, like time belonged to him. His hand went toward his coat. His eyes stayed locked on the other man's face. Not the weapon. That was another thing Doc understood. Weapons can lie. Faces rarely do. The man froze. He saw something in Doc's eyes that he did not like. Not rage, not wildness, control, and control is frightening. The saloon held his breath. Then the man backed down. He spat on the floor, cursed, and pushed through the crowd toward the door. When he left, the air returned to the room. People laughed. Again, but it was nervous laughter. The piano started up. Drinks were poured. Doc sat down and picked up his cards. Like nothing had happened. But something had happened. A story had been born by morning. People would be repeating the moment in different ways. Doc almost killed him. Doc had him shaken. Doc didn't even blink. The details would change, but the main idea would remain. Doc Holliday was not a man to provoke. As the stories grew, so did the contradictions. Some people described him as a gentleman, others described him as a killer. Some said he was a good friend, others said he was trouble in human form. The truth was more complex. Doc could be kind, especially to those he trusted. He could also be ruthless when pushed. He had a sharp tongue, and he knew how to cut with words. He carried pain inside him, physical pain from illness, and emotional pain from the life he had lost. Sometimes that pain made him impatient, sometimes it made him reckless, and sometimes it made him brave. During this time, he stayed close to a woman named Kate. Many people called her Big Nose Kate. She had her own hard story, and she was not the kind of woman who feared judgment. She knew how rough life could be. She knew how quickly people could turn. Doc and Kate were not an easy pair. Their love was not quiet and sweet. It was wild and stormy. They argued. They separated. They returned. They hurt each other and then reached for each other again. But when Doc was at his lowest, Kate sometimes stayed when others left. She saw the man behind the rumors. She saw him cough until his body shook. She saw him stare at nothing when he thought no one was watching. She saw how he tried to hide his weakness behind sharp words and steady eyes. Kate understood, something many people did not. Doc was not chasing danger only because he liked it. He was also running from stillness, because stillness gave him time to think, and thinking reminded him of the truth. His illness was winning, so Doc filled his days and nights with movement, noise, and risk. He traveled, he gambled, he drank at times, he argued at times, he pushed his body beyond what it could handle. It was as if he wanted to live 10 lives before his one life ended. But the West is not only made of saloons and card tables, it is also made of lawmen, and lawmen notice gamblers like Doc. Some lawmen saw Doc as a problem. Others saw him as useful. Some thought he was dangerous. Some thought he was misunderstood. In one town, a lawman warned him to leave. In another, someone offered him work as a dealer or a card player for higher stakes. Doc was always balancing between being welcomed and being hunted. That balancing act was exhausting, and the illness did not get better. It stayed in his chest like a silent enemy. Some mornings he woke up with pain. Some nights he could not sleep. His cough grew worse in cold weather. His face grew thinner, yet he still dressed neatly. He still kept his hair and mustache trimmed. He still tried to appear in control, because control was his armor. Then, slowly a new direction began to form in his life. People started speaking about a town called Tombstone, Arizona. A boom town, a place where silver brought money and money brought conflict. A place where lawmen and outlaws lived close enough to smell each other's breath. And along with Tombstone, Doc kept hearing the name of a man who was becoming known in the West. Wyatt Earp. Doc did not know Wyatt yet, but the name stayed in the air like a signal, because even before they met, their lives were moving toward the same crossroads. Doc kept moving forward, following the next game, the next town, the next chance to win. But in truth, something else was pulling him, a future he did not plan, a friendship he could not predict, and a storm that would turn his name into legend forever. Doc Holliday had learned to live like a moving target. He did not stay in one town long enough to build deep roots. He followed the next card game, the next wave of money, the next place where his cough would not draw too many stares. In one town he would be welcomed, in the next he would be warned to leave. That was the rhythm of his life. And then one day, the rhythm changed, because a new kind of man stepped into Doc's path. Not a gambler, not a loud drunk looking for a fight, a lawman. His name was Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp was not the kind of person who tried to win a room with jokes. He carried himself with a quiet firmness. People around him could feel it. He looked like a man who had made hard decisions and did not regret them. He believed in order, but he lived in a world that did not. Always respected, Doc and Wyatt were different in almost every way. Doc was educated, sick, and sharp as a blade. Wyatt was steady, practical, and built for conflict. And yet, they recognized something in each other. Many people later argued about where they first met. Some stories place it in Texas, in a rough frontier area where trouble could find anyone. Others place it in Kansas, in a land cattle town where men came to drink, gamble, and test their luck. The exact place matters less than the feeling of the meeting. Because when these two men crossed paths, it did not feel like a casual introduction. It felt like a door opening. At first, the connection was not dramatic. It was not a movie scene with instant friendship. It was smaller than that and more real. It started with attention. Wyatt noticed Doc did not behave like most gamblers. Doc was polite even when insulted. Doc did not flinch easily. Doc did not pretend to be something he wasn't. And Doc noticed Wyatt was not like most lawmen. Wyatt did not talk big just to impress people. Wyatt did not look for fights, but he did not avoid them either. Wyatt watched people carefully, the way a man watches a loaded gun. Doc had spent his life reading rooms. He could often tell who was fake, who was dangerous, and who was worth respecting. With Wyatt, Doc saw something rare. He saw a man who meant what he said. That kind of man was uncommon in the West. Their friendship grew in a strange way, like fire catching in dry grass. Not because of laughter and fun, but because of pressure. Because trouble is a fast teacher. And the West was full of trouble. The story that followed became one of the most repeated stories about Doc Holliday. It was a moment when Wyatt was in danger. Wyatt had enemies, like any lawman trying to keep order where order was not wanted. At some point, a tense situation formed around him. One of those moments where people crowd close, voices rise, and a single wrong move can start bloodshed. Doc was there. Doc did not stand back and watch. He stepped in. Some versions of the story say Doc helped Wyatt when Wyatt was about to be attacked. Other versions say Doc's presence alone changed the math for the men who wanted to hurt Wyatt. The details shift depending on who tells it, but the meaning stays the same. Doc backed Wyatt when it mattered. That moment tied them together, because in the West, friendship was not proven by words. It was proven by risk. After that, people began to see them as a pair, an odd pair, a lawman and a gambler, a man trying to enforce rules and a man who lived outside them. It did not make sense at first, but the more people watched, the more it made a different kind of sense. Wyatt Earp understood that Doc, for all his sharp edges, had loyalty. When Doc chose a side, he did not drift away easily. Doc was not the type to promise help to everyone. He was selective, and when he did commit, he committed fully. Doc understood something that Wyatt was strong in the way a mountain is strong. Not loud, not flashy, but solid. Wyatt was not perfect. He could be stubborn, he could be hard, but he was reliable, and reliability was rare in Doc's life. Doc's illness made him feel isolated. It made him feel like the world had already started to push him toward the edge. Many people looked at him and saw a man fading away, but Wyatt looked at him and saw a man who still had value, not as a sick man, as a man that mattered. Still, the friendship was not always smooth. Doc had a temper. He could drink too much. He could say cruel things when he felt cornered. His cough and weakness could make him angry, especially when he felt ashamed of it. Wyatt, on the other hand, did not like chaos. He did not like scenes. He did not like people who drew trouble by choice. And sometimes, Doc did exactly that. There were moments when Wyatt wanted Doc to calm down. There were moments when Doc wanted Wyatt to understand that the West could not be handled gently. They argued at times, they separated at times, but when real danger came, the connection held. That is what made the friendship strong. It was built on friction, not comfort. Doc continued to gamble. He continued to travel. He continued to cough. Some days he looked stronger. Some days he looked like his body might break. But he kept moving because movement was his answer to fear. Wyatt continued his law work, following jobs that took him into towns where crime and money were always in conflict, and slowly, without planning it, their paths began moving toward a bigger stage. Word spread about a new kind of boomtown forming in the Arizona territory, a place full of silver money, crowded saloons, and men who carried guns openly, a place where the line between law and crime was thin. The town had a name that sounded like a warning. Tombstone. Wyatt had reasons to consider it. The ARPs were thinking about opportunities, business, and law work. The West was changing, and Tombstone was becoming important. Doc also had reasons. Gamblers always follow money. Boomtowns attract wealth, and wealth attracts card tables. But for Doc, there was something else, too. If Wyatt went, Doc was drawn that way as well. Not because he wanted to be a hero, not because he wanted to be famous, because the West had given him very few real friendships, and he was not willing to lose one of them. As Tombstone grew, tension grew with it, and if Wyatt Earp was stepping into that pressure, he would need people he could trust. People who would stand in the heat without running. Doc Holliday was sick, thin, and living on borrowed time. But when it came to standing his ground, he was one of the most stubborn men alive. So Doc headed toward Tombstone's shadow, following the trail of silver rumors and conflict. He did not know exactly what was waiting there, but he could feel it. The next chapter of his life would not just be about cards. It would be about loyalty, gunsmoke, and a moment that would freeze his name in history forever. Tombstone did not feel like a normal town. It felt like a fever. People came for silver and stayed for money. The streets were busy, even when the sun was harsh. Wagons rolled by. Horses stamped the dirt. Men talked loud, laughed louder, and watched each other closely. In Tombstone, even a smile could be a challenge. When Doc Holliday arrived, he could sense the pressure in the air right away. This was not a quiet frontier stop. This was not a quiet frontier stop that one lucky child found in order to change the future, in order to change the future. In Tombstone, even a smile could be a challenge. This was a boom town, new, proud, and hungry. Saloons stood close together like they were competing. Gambling tables filled quickly. Money moved fast, and when money moved fast, trouble moves with it. Doc's cough did not stop him from stepping inside. He walked into Tombstone like a man who had already accepted what life was. He did not look for attention, but attention found him anyway. People noticed his thin frame, his educated way of speaking, and the calm look in his eyes. Some saw him as a curiosity. Some saw him as danger. The Earp brothers were there too. They were not perfect men, but they were serious about their place in the town. They were tied to law work and business hopes. Tombstone offered opportunity, but it also offered enemies. Wyatt Earp stood out, not because he talked big, but because he stood still. He watched, he measured, he understood that towns like this did not fall apart in one day. They cracked slowly, then suddenly broke. Doc stayed close to Wyatt, often seen in the same places, saloons, gambling rooms, busy streets. People began to connect them, the lawman and the gambler, the steady man and the sick man, the strange pair that somehow made sense. But Tombstone had another force in it, and that force did not like the Arabs. Men in the area were known as cowboys. They were not cowboys in the simple, harmless way. Many locals believed some of them were tied to crime, robberies, threats, and rough power. They were the kind of men who acted like rules were for other people, and they did not like anyone telling them what to do. Tombstone became a town with two sides, One side wanted order, the other side wanted control. Both sides were armed. Both sides had pride. And pride is one of the most dangerous things a man can carry. Doc, as always, found himself in the middle. He did not wear a badge, but he was connected to men who did. And that alone made him a target. In a tense town, people do not need a strong reason to hate someone. Sometimes they only need a connection. Doc also had a sharp mouth. He could insult a man without raising his voice. He could make people feel small with a few words. It was not always wise, but it was part of who he was. When his health was bad, his patience was worse. He did not enjoy being pushed, and in Tombstone, people pushed each other constantly. There were nights when the saloons were so loud they felt like storms. Music played, glasses clinked, men shouted over games and drinks. The air was thick with smoke and sweat. Doc often sat at a table, cards in his hands, eyes scanning the room. He was always watching. A man like Doc watched for hands that moved too fast. He watched for eyes that avoided his. He watched for anger growing in small steps. Sometimes he watched Wyatt too, because Wyatt had enemies who were not joking. Soon, the town started to rumble with ugly talk. People argued about law and power. Some called the Earps bullies. Others called them necessary. Some said the cowboys were criminals. Others said they were just men being men. The truth was not clean, and Tombstone was not a place that rewarded clean truth. Doc's personal life was also uneasy. Kate was in the picture, and their relationship still carried the same storms. Some days they were close, other days they fought, like two fires colliding. But even when they clashed, they seemed tied together. In a town full of strangers, Kate was one of the few people who knew Doc in a real way. She knew what the cough meant. She knew what the nights of weakness meant. She knew the hard truth he tried to hide. Doc did not like being seen as fragile. He did not want pity, so he covered his weakness with sharpness, jokes that cut, and a kind of calm that looked like fearlessness. But inside him, the clock kept ticking. As weeks passed, the tension in Tombstone became more serious. Small incidents stacked on top of each other. Threats became bolder. Arguments became more public. People began to choose sides without even saying it out loud. A look across a bar could mean, not your friend. A hand resting on a pistol could mean, try me. Wyatt and his brothers worked to keep control, but control in Tombstone was like holding water in your hands. It slipped through fingers. It found cracks. Doc, because of his friendship with Wyatt, became pulled deeper into the town's conflict. He was not a leader, but he was a symbol, a living signal that the ARPs were not alone. That fact made some men angry. One night, a tense encounter flared. Words were exchanged, the kind of words that do not disappear the next morning. The kind of words that stay in a man's mind, replaying like a song he hates but cannot stop hearing. Doc's temper rose quickly. He had never been good at swallowing insults. And in Tombstone, insults came like dust, always present, always drifting into every corner. People began to whisper that something big was coming. Not a simple fight, not a quick argument, something final. The town had rules about weapons, but the rules were only as strong as the men enforcing them. And there were plenty of men in Tombstone who did not want to be enforced. Guns were everywhere, in belts, in coats, under tables, behind bar counters. Some people carried weapons like they carried confidence. Others carried weapons because they expected to need them. Then came the moment when the tension turned into a countdown. A group of cowboys was seen armed in town, and it became clear they were not backing down. There was talk that they had been warned before. There was talk that they were daring the law to act. Wyatt and his brothers could feel it. This was no longer a rumor storm. This was a real threat forming shape. Doc could feel it too. He saw the way men stood in groups. He saw the way eyes tracked. The ARPs, he saw the way hands stayed close to guns, like dogs waiting for a command. The night before the breaking point, Tombstone felt strangely sharp. Even the laughter sounded forced. Even the music sounded thin. The town was like a room where two men were staring at each other, waiting to see who moved first. Doc sat quietly, his face calm, but his body tired. He coughed again, low and controlled, into a cloth. Then he looked at Wyatt. No big speech, no dramatic promise, just a silent understanding that mattered most in the West. If it happens, it happens. And if it happens, he will not run. As dawn approached, Tombstone did not wake gently. It woke like a man with a bad feeling in his stomach. People moved through the streets, acting normal, but watching everything. The air felt tight. The dust seemed to hang longer. Somewhere nearby, armed men gathered. Somewhere nearby, the law prepared to respond, and Doc Holliday, the dying gambler with a dentist's education, stood close to the men he had chosen as his own, because in Tombstone, on a day like this, friendship was not a feeling, it was a decision, and the town was only a few steps away from gunfire. The morning of the gunfight did not start with gunfire. It started with quiet. Tombstone was awake, but it felt tense, like a town holding its breath. People walked a little faster. Conversations ended too quickly. Men kept their eyes moving, watching corners and doorways. Even the horses seemed restless. Doc Holliday moved through that morning with a familiar tightness in his chest. He coughed once into a cloth and kept walking. He did not look like a hero. He looked like a man who had slept poorly and knew worse was coming. Wyatt Earp and his brothers were already alert. They had heard the talk. They had seen the armed men. They understood what it meant when a group refused to disarm in a town trying to enforce rules. Tombstone had an ordinance about carrying weapons in town. Some people respected it, some did not. And the ones who did not often did it on purpose. Like a message. That day, the message was clear. A group of men connected to the cowboys had been seen armed. The situation was rising fast. The air felt dry and sharp, and it seemed like one small spark could set everything on fire. Virgil Earp, who was the town marshal, made a decision. He could ignore it and look weak, or he could act and risk a violent clash. In towns like Tombstone, ignoring trouble did not make trouble disappear. It only made it grow. So Virgil gathered his side. He brought Wyatt, he brought Morgan, and he brought Doc Holliday. Doc was not a lawman by nature, but on the frontier lines could shift quickly. When a situation became serious, people who could be trusted were pulled in close. Virgil did not want uncertain men at his back. He wanted men who would stand. Doc had his faults, but running was not one of them. As they moved, the town seemed to notice. Faces appeared in windows. People stood in doorways. A few stepped back from the street, as if making room for something invisible that was coming. Doc walked with them, his expression calm, but inside him, he could feel the pulse of the moment. This was not a bar argument. This was not a wild rumor. This was the kind of day that becomes history. They headed toward a narrow area near the Corral, a space that was not wide enough for mistakes. It was not a grand battlefield. It was not a big open street. It was a tight place where men would be close enough to see each other's eyes, and that made it worse. Because when men stand too close, fear has nowhere to hide. They spotted the cowboys group ahead. The men were armed, and the mood around them was hard. Some looked angry. Some looked ready. Some looked like they were waiting for the ARPs to make the first move. Doc's eyes moved. Across faces and hands. Hands mattered most. A hand near a gun was a threat. A hand that twitched was a warning. The ARPs slowed as they approached. Virgil held the lead. Wyatt was near him. Morgan close. Doc walked with them, slightly to the side, like a shadow that had decided to become real. Doc carried a weapon that fit the moment. Not a delicate tool, not a gambler's showpiece, something meant for close danger. People later argued about who said what first. That is what happens when seconds decide everything. In the retelling, everyone wants their version to be the true one. But what matters is not the exact words. What matters is the pressure. Virgil's goal was simple: disarm them. The cowboy's goal was also simple: not be controlled. The two goals could not share the same space. Virgil spoke, firm and clear, telling them to raise their hands and give up their weapons. For a breath, time felt slow. The town held still around them. Men in nearby buildings leaned forward to listen. Doc's mouth was closed. He did not try to speak over Virgil. His job was not to negotiate. His job was to be ready. The cowboys did not move the way the ERPs wanted. Some shifted their feet. Some touched their weapons. One or two spoke back in anger. The distance between both sides felt smaller than it should have been. And then it happened. A movement, flash of intent, a sound that could have been a command or a curse, and the world snapped. Gunfire exploded in the tight space like thunder trapped between walls. The first shots cracked the air, and then everything became noise. It was fast. Too fast for careful thought, too fast for second chances. Doc moved with sharp purpose. The sick man became sudden speed. He raised his weapon and fired into the chaos. Smoke leaped forward. The sound was heavy and close, like the town itself had been hit. Wyatt fired too. Morgan fired. Virgil fired. On the other side, the cowboys fired back. It was not clean. It was not dramatic in a slow way. It was brutal and quick. People later said the whole gunfight lasted less than a minute. That is what makes it so frightening. A lifetime of choices. And then a storm of bullets that ends in seconds. 30 seconds can change history. In the middle of the shots, men fell. One cowboy stumbled and collapsed, his body hitting the dirt hard. Another tried to move, tried to fight through pain, and then dropped. A third was struck and could not stay standing. The air filled with gun smoke and dust. Shouts blended with shots. Boots scraped the ground. A man cried out. Another voice cursed, sharp and raw. Doc's heart pounded. His lungs burned. His illness did not pause for the gunfight. Even as he fired, his chest felt tight, like it was reminding him that death could come in more than one way. Then, as quickly as it began, it ended. The last shot echoed, and silence rushed in behind it, heavy and strange. Men stood frozen, weapons still raised, eyes wide, breathing hard. Smoke drifted like fog. The town felt unreal, like it had stepped outside itself. Then people looked around and saw what the moment had done. Several cowboys lay dead or dying on the ground. Others were wounded. Blood darkened the dirt. The hard talk that had filled Tombstone for weeks had finally turned into a final price. On the URP side, not everyone was standing strong either. Virgil was wounded. Morgan was wounded. Doc had taken a hit or a graze, the kind of wound that burned but did not drop him. Wyatt, somehow, remained standing without serious injury. Doc looked down for a moment, not at the bodies, but at his own hands. They did not shake. His face stayed controlled. But inside him, something shifted. He was not just a gambler anymore. He was now tied to a moment the whole country would talk about. People came running. Some screamed. Some stared. Some acted like they could not believe what they had seen, even though they had felt it coming. And then the next truth arrived, as it always does after violence. The fighting was over. But the consequences were just beginning, because a gunfight might last seconds, but the judgment lasts much longer. Soon, the law moved in a new direction. There would be questions. There would be accusations. There would be arrests and hearings. People would argue about who was right and who was wrong. Doc Holliday stepped back into the smoke-filled air, coughing again, quietly. He had survived the gunfight, but he could feel it. Tombstone would never be the same, and neither would he when the gunfire ended near the Yoki Corral. Tombstone did not return to normal. It could not. The town looked the same on the outside: dusty streets, busy saloons, men walking with stiff pride, but something inside the town had cracked. People had seen blood on the ground, and once a town sees that, it remembers that Doc Holliday walked away from the gunfight alive, but not untouched. His body was already fighting sickness, and now it had faced bullets too. His lungs still burned. When he breathed, his cough still came, heavy and stubborn. But the worst pain was not in his chest. It was in the air around him, because after a violent moment, the West always asked the same question: who was right? And in Tombstone, many people had already decided their answers. Some people said the ARPs and Doc had done their duty. They said the law had tried to disarm armed men, and the armed men refused. They said the gunfight was not murder, was a result. Other people said the opposite. They said the IRPs were too harsh. They said the cowboys were treated unfairly. They said the gunfight was planned, and the law used rules as an excuse to kill. The truth did not feel simple. And when truth does not feel simple, the town becomes divided. Doc felt those eyes on him everywhere. In a saloon, a stranger would stare too long. On the street, a man would stop talking when Doc passed. In the gambling room, a quiet insult would slip into a conversation like poison. The tension did not fade. It grew. Soon, the law stepped in. There had to be an investigation. There had to be questions. Tombstone could not pretend the gunfight did not happen. It was too public, too loud, too final. Doc and the IRPs were pulled into hearings and legal trouble. They were treated like men under a magnifying glass. Every move they made was studied. Every word was repeated and changed by gossip. Some witnesses spoke with honesty. Others spoke with fear. Others spoke with anger. Doc was not built for that kind of courtroom world. He was sharp, but he was impatient. He did not like being judged by people who had never faced what he had faced. He did not like sitting still while others decided his fate with words. But he sat anyway, because this time, a gun could not solve the problem. During those days, Doc's illness felt closer. Stress can make a sick body weaker, and Doc was not a strong man physically anymore. He looked thin. He looked tired. Sometimes his hands seemed cold even when the day was warm. But his eyes stayed steady. He did not beg. He did not apologize for surviving. He also did not act proud about the deaths. Doc was not smiling about what happened. He knew the gunfight was not something to celebrate. It was a hard moment, not a victory. Still, people wanted a simple story, and they wanted a villain. Doc was easy to label. He was the gambler, the outsider, the sick man with a gun in the minds of many. That made him the perfect target. Even when the legal process moved forward, and the Earps and Docs were not convicted as criminals, the town did not calm down. Sometimes, a court decision does not end conflict. It only changes its shape, because the anger was no longer only legal. It became personal. Tombstone started to feel like a place where the next violence was already waiting. People on both sides carried old grudges like loaded pistols. Men gathered in corners and whispered. Some smiled in public but threatened in private. Doc could feel that threat in the smallest things. A man stepping aside too late. A hand resting too casually near a gun. A laugh that sounded wrong. Doc began to move like he always moved in dangerous places, watching, measuring, staying ready. Wyatt Earp also watched. But Wyatt's burden was heavier. Wyatt had family in this fight. He had brothers. He had a name tied to law and order. If he backed down, he risked losing everything he had built in the town. And if he pushed too hard, he risked a war. Doc had fewer things to lose. But he had one thing he would not give up easily: loyalty. If Wyatt was threatened, Doc felt it as if it were aimed at him too. Then Tombstone crossed a line that could not be UNCROSSCD. One night, Virgil Earp was attacked. It was not a fair fight. It was not a clean duel in the street. It was an ambush, shots fired in the dark from hiding. Virgil survived, but he was badly injured. Part of his body was damaged in a way that would stay with him. The message was clear. This was not just about arguments anymore. This was revenge. Tombstone grew colder after that. People stopped pretending they were only disagreeing. Now they were hunting. Wyatt's family was under threat, and everyone knew it. Men who supported the IRPs felt fear too. Men who hated them felt boldness. The town became a place where violence was no longer a surprise. It was expected Doc stayed close to Wyatt during this time, but even that had a cost. Doc had enemies of his own. Some were real, some were created by rumors. In Tombstone, a man's reputation could become a weapon used against him. And Doc's reputation was already sharp. Kate worried in her own way, but Doc did not know how to live carefully. He never had, not since the illness entered his life. If anything, danger made him more focused. It made him feel awake then. The worst blow landed. Morgan Earp was killed. It was another attack that did not feel like justice. It felt like murder in the shadows. A shot fired when a man was not expecting it. A life taken quickly, leaving nothing but shock and grief behind. When Morgan died, something changed inside Wyatt. Before, Wyatt had tried to stand as a lawman. He tried to hold the line. He tried to believe the system could handle the problem. After Morgan, Wyatt became something else. A brother in mourning, a man filled with purpose, a man who no longer trusted that Tombstone would protect his family. Wyatt did not shout. He did not cry in the street. He became quiet in a way that was more dangerous than noise. Doc saw it. Doc understood it. Doc had been living with death for years, but this was different. This was not sickness. This was a human choice. Someone had decided Morgan should die, and now Wyatt was deciding something to Doc. Wyatt needed to protect what was left of his family. He needed to move them, guard them, and make sure no more bullets found their names. He also needed to answer the violence with action, because in the West, unanswered violence invites more violence. Doc did not ask for a speech. He did not need one. Wyatt looked at him, and Doc looked back. The message passed between them without words. This is not over. In the days that followed, Tombstone felt like a trap. The streets were the same, but the air was poison. Every corner felt watched. Every door felt like it could hide a gunman. Wyatt prepared to move, to protect his family, and to strike back if he had to. Doc, the sick gambler with the steady eyes, made his choice again. He could leave and save himself, or he could stay with the one friend he trusted. Even if it led straight into more danger, Doc Holliday chose loyalty, and as Tombstone's shadows grew longer, the next chapter formed one, filled with night rides, hard decisions, and a promise that revenge would not remain only a whisper. The storm was not ending. It was only changing direction. After Morgan Earp was killed, Tombstone did not feel like a town anymore. It felt like a cage. The streets were still there. The saloons still opened. People still tried to laugh, but everyone could sense the truth behind the normal sounds. A line had been crossed, and no one knew where the next bullet would land. Wyatt Earp did not speak much after Morgan's death. He did not make big speeches. He did not beg the town for help. He became quiet and focused, like a man who had one clear mission and nothing else left to protect it. When Doc Holliday watched him closely, Doc had seen men break before. Some broke loudly, with tears and shouting. Others broke silently, turning into someone new without warning. Wyatt's grief did not make him weaker. It made him harder. And Doc understood that kind of change. Doc had been living with death for years. He had felt it in his lungs, in his coffin, in the way his strength disappeared in small pieces. But this death was different. This was not sickness. This was a human choice. Someone had decided Morgan should not live. That kind of death leaves a stain. Wyatt's first goal was to protect what remained of his family. Virgil Earp was injured, and he needed to leave Tombstone safely. The danger was too close. The threats were too real. If Virgil stayed, he might not survive another attack. So, Wyatt prepared an escort. Not just a friendly escort. Not just walking someone to a train. This was a hard movement through enemy territory. It meant traveling while watching rooftops, alleys, windows, and shadows. It meant expecting the worst. A small group gathered around Wyatt, men he trusted. Men who could ride, shoot, and stay calm under pressure. Doc Holliday was among them. For Doc, this was not a legal duty. This was not a job. This was a choice. He could have left Tombstone. He could have slipped away and saved his own skin. He could have disappeared into another town and sat at another card table. But Doc did not leave. He stayed because loyalty was one of the few things he still respected. And if Wyatt was walking into danger, Doc was going with him. The ride out of Tombstone felt heavy. Dust rose behind the horses. The sun was bright, but the mood was dark. People watched them go, some with respect, some with hate, some with fear. When a group of armed men rides out after a killing, everyone understands what it might mean. Soon, events turned sharper. At a train stop in Tucson, tension rose again. The air felt tight. The group was alert. Wyatt's eyes moved the way they always did, slow, careful, measuring danger. Then something happened that would haunt the story for generations. A man connected to the conflict, often named as Frank Stillwell, was found dead near the tracks. Many accounts describe it as a revenge killing connected to Morgan's death, but the details have always been argued. Different people claim different things. Some witnesses spoke, others stayed silent. Some said one thing in one year and another thing later. In the West, truth often gets buried under fear. But one thing is clear. After Tucson, the situation became a hunt. Wyatt was no longer just a lawman trying to keep order. In the eyes of many, he became a man taking justice into his own hands. Some supported him, others wanted him arrested, and those who hated him wanted him dead. That is how the Vendetta Ride began. It was not called that in the moment, not like a formal title. It became that later, because it fit the feeling. A ride fueled by grief, a ride shaped by anger, a ride where the goal was not only survival, but repayment. Doc rode alongside Wyatt through hard land. The days were dry, and the nights were cold. The group moved quickly, always watching behind them, always expecting to be followed. There, horses needed rest, but rest was dangerous. A campfire could be seen from far away. A pause could turn into an ambush. Doc's illness did not disappear during this ride. It stayed with him like a shadow. Some nights, he coughed into his sleeve and tried to keep the sound low. He did not want to look weak. He did not want to slow the group down. He did not want Wyatt to worry about him, not when Wyatt was carrying a heavier pain. But Doc's body was fighting two battles. One battle was against the men who wanted him dead. The other battle was inside his chest, where his lungs kept tightening, reminding him that he was still running out of time. Still, he rode. He rode because he had already accepted his own ending, and that acceptance gave him a strange strength. As they traveled, the group clashed with enemies. Some meetings were sudden, like storms that appear without warning. Some were planned, based on information and rumors. Not every story about these days is perfectly clear, and history does not always agree on every detail. But the pattern is clear. Wyatt's group was striking back. They were hunting the men they believed were connected to the attacks on the Earps, and each violent moment pushed them further away from the clean idea of law. In the West, people like simple labels: hero, villain, good, bad. But on this ride, those labels did not fit well. Wyatt believed he was answering murder. The other side believed they were resisting power. and Doc was in the middle, not as the main leader, but as the loyal man who refused to step away. Some nights, Doc watched Wyatt when Wyatt thought no one was watching. Wyatt would sit still, staring into the distance, like he could see Morgan's last moments in the dark. Doc did not interrupt. Doc knew that kind of silence. Silence can be heavy, but it can also be a promise. The ride created new enemies. It also created new fear around their names. People began to talk about the group like they were ghosts riding through the territory. Some spoke with admiration, some spoke with hatred, but almost everyone spoke carefully, because these were men who had lost their patience with rules. And when men lose patience with rules, the world becomes dangerous fast. Doc's friendship with Wyatt grew deeper on that ride, not because they shared joy, but because they shared pressure. It is easy to be friends in calm times. It is harder to stay friends when every mile could be the last. Doc stayed. He stayed when the trail was rough. He stayed when danger was near. He stayed even when his own body was weakening. At one point, Doc coughed so hard he had to stop and breathe. He leaned forward, hands on his knees, forcing air into lungs that did not want to work. Sweat formed on his forehead. The world blurred for a moment. Then he straightened up. He wiped his mouth. He climbed back onto his horse. Because Doc Holliday did not want to be remembered as a man who quit. He wanted to be remembered as a man who stood by his friend. But the Vendetta Ride could not last forever. The territory was too large. Enemies were too many. The law was turning against them. Warrants and accusations began to follow their names like wolves. The group was being chased now, not only by personal enemies, but by the weight of the system itself. And Doc could feel it. The ride that started as protection and revenge was turning into something else. A breaking point, a crossroads. Soon, Doc Holliday would face a choice again, one that could separate him from Wyatt or tie him to Wyatt's fate even deeper. And in the West, choices like that never come without a price. After the Vendetta Ride, the open desert behind Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday did not feel like freedom. It felt like a narrow escape. They had left Arizona with heat on their backs, not only angry enemies, but also legal trouble. Warrants and accusations followed their names. In the West, a man could outrun some things. He could outrun a posse for a while. He could outrun gossip for a while. But paper in a courthouse had a long reach, and time had patience. The group traveled into New Mexico. For a short time, they tried to stay quiet, to stay out of sight, to breathe without looking over their shoulders every second. But staying quiet did not come naturally to men who had been living inside a storm dot in Albuquerque. Pressure turned inward. Wyatt was tense and protective. He was carrying grief like a heavy coat that never came off. Doc was tired, sick, and sharp-edged. His body was failing him in slow steps, and that made his temper quick. A hard life can make a man careful, but it can also make him mean. One day, words were exchanged between Doc and Wyatt. It was not a gunfight. It was not a fistfight. It was something quieter and more painful. A friendship scraping against stress. Harsh comments were said. Pride rose. The misunderstanding grew. They did not end as enemies, but they did part ways. It was the kind of separation that happens when two men are exhausted and there is no room left for patience. They promised, in their own way, that it was not forever. But the road split, and for a time, they rode different directions. Wyatt went north with some of the men, trying to rebuild a life away from Arizona's heat dot. With his cough and his stubborn spirit, drifted toward Colorado. Colorado was different. The towns were still rough, but the air was colder, and the mountains looked like they could swallow a man whole. Doc arrived in that world as a known name now. People had heard of Tombstone. They had heard of the Corral. They had heard rumors of the Vendetta Ride. Some people stared at him like he was a story that had stepped off a page. Doc acted like he did not care. But he did care. A little. Because fame in the West was not safety. It was a spotlight. and a spotlight makes it easier for trouble to aim. Not long after he reached Colorado, the past caught up to him. A warrant arrived tied to the killing of Frank Stillwell in Tucson. The charge was serious. If Doc was sent back to Arizona, he feared the trial might not be fair at all. In a place like Tombstone, men sometimes decided punishment before a judge ever spoke. Doc was arrested in Denver. For a man like Doc, jail was not only a cage, it was a threat. Not because he could not survive it, but because he knew what could happen if powerful enemies had time to plan. Wyatt heard about Doc's arrest, and even though they had argued, he did not abandon him. Wyatt reached out to friends. One of those friends was Bat Masterson, a lawman with influence. Plans were made fast, legal tricks were used, paperwork was examined, the extradition request had problems, and Colorado's governor was pushed to look closely. Doc sat in a cell. While the world argued about him, he did not panic. That was not his style. But inside, he could feel the same cold truth he always felt. He was a man on borrowed time, and now the world wanted to collect early. In the end, Doc was not sent back to Arizona. The extradition effort failed, and he was released. He walked out of jail into the Colorado air, breathing like a man who had just escaped a second hanging. But even freedom had a cost. Doc was still sick. The mountains were high, and thin air is not kind to damaged lungs. The cold also cut deep, and he could feel it in his chest. Still, Colorado offered something he needed. Distance. Distance from Tombstone. Distance from the worst enemies. Distance from the place where every street corner reminded him of Gunsmoke. So Doc drifted again. Doing what he had always done to survive, he gambled. He moved where money moved. He stayed close to saloons and card tables, because that was where his skills still paid. For a while, he found himself in Leadville, Colorado, a hard mining town filled with rough men and fast cash. It was the kind of place where a gambler could make money quickly, or lose his life quickly. Doc tried to settle into that rhythm, but his health did not improve. If anything, the altitude made him worse. He began to lean more on alcohol and medicine to dull the pain in his chest and the constant weakness in his body. Sometimes, when he sat at a table, he looked like the old Doc Sharp. Eyes, calm hands, controlled face. Other times, he looked worn out, like a candle burning down too close to the wick. In Leadville, trouble found him again, because trouble always finds men with a reputation. An argument grew with a man named Billy Allen. The details, as always, became messy in the telling. But the ending was clear. A confrontation turned violent, and Doc shot Allen. Allen survived. But the event pulled Doc into court once more. Doc stood trial in a world that was trying to decide what he really was. Was he a criminal who used guns to easily, or was he a man defending himself in a violent place? Doc claimed self-defense. People argued. Witnesses spoke. The town watched. And again, Doc did not beg. He did not perform sadness. He simply stood there, thin and pale, as if his body was already half gone, and waited for strangers to decide what to do. With what was left, he was acquitted. He walked free again, but something was changing in him. And it was not only the law, it was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that does not leave after sleep. The kind that sits in the bones. Doc's glory days were behind him now. Tombstone had been the center of the storm. Colorado was the long, slow aftermath. He was still alive, but the fire was fading. Somewhere along the way, he and Wyatt crossed paths again briefly. The friendship was not erased by one argument. It had been forged too deeply for that. But it also was not the same simple bond it once was. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. Doc continued drifting. He tried lower places and warmer air when he could. He looked older than his years. His hair began to change. His face grew more hollow. The coffin became louder, harder to hide. And one day the truth that had followed him for so long stepped closer. The West could not distract him anymore. The cards could not distract him anymore. His body was calling the final bet. In 1887, Doc moved toward Glenwood Springs, hoping the hot springs might help his lungs, even just a little. He arrived not as the bold gambler of Tombstone, but as a man trying to breathe. He checked into a hotel. He rested more than he used to, and for perhaps the first time in years, he could not pretend he was outrunning death, because death was no longer behind him. It was waiting in the next room, and Doc Holliday, the dentist who became a legend, was walking toward the quiet ending he never believed would happen. Not in the street, not with his boots on, but in a bed, with the weight of a whole life finally settling around him. Doc Holliday had spent years living like a man who would not get an ending. He moved from town to town as if stillness could kill him faster. He sat at card tables like tomorrow was a rumor. He walked into danger with a calm face, even when his lungs were burning. People thought that made him fearless, but the truth was quieter. Doc was not fearless. He was simply familiar with death. For a long time, the West helped him forget that. The noise, the travel, the fights, the gambling, everything kept his mind busy. Everything kept him moving. And movement gave him the feeling that he still had control. But by 1887, control was slipping. His cough was no longer something he could hide. His body was thinner than ever. His steps were slower. The life that once looked sharp and fast now felt heavy and tired. Doc did what many sick people did in those days. He looked for relief in places that promised it. He heard about Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where hot springs were believed to help people who were weak or ill. Some said the warm water could heal. Some said the air could help the lungs. Some said it was peaceful. Doc went there with a small hope. Not the kind of hope that expects a miracle. The kind of hope that only wants a little more bread. When Doc arrived in Glenwood Springs, he did not look like a famous frontier figure. He looked like a man who had been fighting too long. His face was pale. His eyes still held that sharp focus, but his body could not keep up with his spirit anymore. He checked into a hotel. For a man like Doc, that was strange. He was used to saloons and back rooms and noisy nights. He was used to danger. A quiet hotel room felt almost unreal, like a world he did not belong in. In that room, the West finally caught up to him. Not the West of gunfights and badges. The West of cold mornings, empty breath, and long silence. Doc spent days resting. Sometimes he could sit up, sometimes he could not. He listened to the sounds, outside the footsteps in the hall, the distant voices, the wind. He looked out the window and saw mountains that did not care who he was. He had lived like a legend, but now he was only a man, and his body was tired. People around him may have expected a dramatic ending. Many legends die in the street with guns and shouting. Many people believed that is how Doc Holliday would go too. They imagined a final gunfight, a last stand, a big scene. But real life does not always follow the story people want. Doc's ending was quiet. On November 8th, 1887, Doc Holliday died in that hotel room. He was only 36 years old. His life had been full of noise, but his last moments were calm, almost still, and there is a detail people remember, because it feels like the final twist of his story. It is said that Doc looked down at his feet and noticed he was not wearing boots. Then he smiled and found it funny, because he had always believed he would die with his boots on. No saloon, no street, no gun in his hand, just a bed, a fading breath, and the strange surprise of a quiet ending. That moment mattered because it showed the truth behind the legend that Doc Holliday was not just a wild gunman. He was a man who expected a violent end, because his whole life had pointed that way, but he did not get the ending he expected. He got the ending that his illness had been writing all along. After he died, stories kept growing. That is what happens when a person becomes a symbol. People told the story of the gunfight at the Corral again and again. They told the story of Doc standing beside Wyatt Earp, sick but steady, in the tight space where seconds became history. And they added more. They said Doc killed many men. They said he was the deadliest of them all. They made him bigger, darker, sharper. Some of that was exaggeration. Some of it was fear. Some of it was the way people build legends when they do not want simple truths. Historians have argued for years about how many men Doc truly killed. The truth seems smaller than the rumor. But even if his body count was not huge, his reputation became huge, because reputation in the West was not only about what a man did, it was about what people believed he would do. Doc's real power was in the way he carried himself. He was educated, but he lived among rough men. He was sick, but he faced danger. He was polite, but he could be deadly when pushed. And he had something that made his story last longer than gunsmoke. Loyalty. Doc did not have to stand with Wyatt Earp. He could have walked away. He could have chosen an easier path. He could have saved himself from other men's trouble. But he stayed. He stayed when Tombstone turned into a war zone. He stayed when the town turned against them. He stayed when the ride into danger became a ride into history. That is why people still talk about him. Because deep down, people do not only love stories about violence, they love stories about someone who shows up when it is hard. Doc Holliday was not a perfect man. He could be rude. He could drink too much. He could act reckless. He could chase trouble when he should have walked away. But he was also brave in a quiet way. Not because he wanted applause, because he had already made peace with losing. And once a man makes peace with losing, he becomes hard to scare. That is the real Doc Holliday, not just a gun, not just a gambler, a dying man who chose to live loudly anyway, a friend who stood by his side when it cost everything, and a human being who became a legend, even though his ending was simple. If this true story surprised you, and you want more real Wild West biographies told like a movie, then subscribe to the channel and comment below. Was Doc Holliday a hero, a villain, or just a man trying to outrun time? Your answer decides who this channel covers next.